Normandy, July 1944. A German infantry platoon takes up a position at the edge of a wood at a bend in the road. Everything is done right. The machine gun is set up to sweep the open field. The Americans will be forced to cross. The position is chosen wisely, behind a hedgerow, in the shade, with a route of withdrawal. The platoon commander, a master sergeant with 3 years of war behind him, knows his trade. He fought in Russia. He knows how to hold a position. He opens fire exactly when the first Americans step into the open. One short burst, and then, by all the rules he was taught, the platoon should shift position, because opening fire has given it away. He gives the order to pull back. But the platoon doesn't make it. Within 3 minutes, not half an hour, 3 minutes, down on its position comes not return machine gun fire, not a couple of mortar rounds. Down on it comes everything. 100 shells fall at once in a single second, as if fired from one gigantic gun. The edge of the woods ceases to exist. And here begins the question we're here for today. How? The German fired one shot. He was behind a hedgerow, in the shade, invisible. No one was walking down the road to point him out. Not a single aircraft hung overhead at that moment. He fired and began to withdraw, as he'd been taught. And within 3 minutes, he was dead under fire so dense it seemed a whole army was hitting him. German infantrymen who survived this and ended up as prisoners repeated the same thing, over and over under interrogation. We don't understand. We fired once. We were undercover. How did they know where we were, and how did they manage to answer so fast, with all that force at once? In the German records, there's a precise word for it: incomprehensible. Some German officers decided the Americans had some device that instantly pinpointed a shooter. Others thought the American artillery was simply plastering the area at random, sparing no shells. They're rich, they can afford it. Still, others suspected an invisible spotter sitting somewhere nearby. All 3 guesses were wrong. No one guessed the truth, because the Americans had no device that instantly found a shooter, and they weren't firing at the area at random. They were firing precisely, and there was no lone invisible man who decided everything either. They had something else, something the German couldn't imagine because it didn't look like a weapon. The answer to this question isn't about guns, it's about how an army is built that joined eyes, brain, and fists into a single nervous system. Part 1. Why artillery was blind. To understand what happened at that forest edge, you have to understand the ancient problem of all artillery. It's simple and agonizing. A gun strikes far, much farther than the man standing next to it can see. A howitzer can drop a shell beyond a hill, beyond a forest, 10 kilometers away, to a place the gunner will never lay eyes on. But on one condition: someone has to look at the target and tell the gun where to fire. And that's where the whole drama lies. The most powerful weapon on the battlefield is blind almost all of the time. It can destroy anything it sees, and it sees almost nothing. The one who looks at the target, call him the observer, the spotter, is far ahead, right next to the enemy, and the guns are far behind, in safety. Between them is distance. And the question of all 20th century artillery science was this: how do you connect the eye that sees the target with the hand that strikes? How do you convey what the man up front sees to those standing at the guns behind, quickly, accurately, and in such a way that the shells arrive while the target is still there? In the First World War, this is how it was done. The observer sat in a tower next to his own battery and corrected the fire of his guns only. His battery, half a dozen guns. He saw where the shells landed, shouted a correction, and the battery fired again. Slowly, clumsily, but it worked. And, importantly, each battery fought on its own observer, its own guns, its own little self-contained world. The German army in the Second World War did this better than in the First. The Germans were superb artillerymen with a long tradition, excellent guns, well-trained crews. Their observer also corrected the fire, also passed data back, but he passed it mostly by wire, by field telephone. And here is the crack into which the Americans would drive a wedge. The wire telephone is wonderful as long as no one moves. As long as the front holds, as long as the wire is intact, as long as the observer sits in one place, it all works. But the War of 1944 did not stand still. It rolled forward, and the moment troops began to move, the wire became a curse. It was torn by shrapnel. It was cut by tank tracks. It couldn't keep up with the advancing infantry. The observer moving forward with the attackers dragged a spool behind him, and at any moment could be left without communication. And without communication, the eye is blind. German artillery remained tethered to the wire, to pre-calculated positions, to an unhurried order. It was strong, but slow. And into that slowness, into that gap between the eye and the hand, the Americans drove something a German would later call incomprehensible. But for it to work, another problem had to be solved first. Not communication, mathematics. Part 2. The Brain in Oklahoma. Here, we have to break the first expectation. We think wars are won on battlefields, but this particular advantage was not born on a battlefield. It was born in a dull classroom of a military school on the Oklahoma prairie, in a place called Fort Sill in the 1930s, 10 years before the war, when no one was watching. The problem they were solving there wasn't about bravery, and it wasn't about guns. It was about time. Picture it. The observer has seen the target. He's passed the coordinates, and now the work begins at the guns. The calculation, where to aim the barrel, at what angle, how much powder, which fuse. All of it has to be computed, and computed precisely, because an error in the calculation means a shell into an empty field, or worse, onto your own men. In the old system, each battery computed this itself, for itself, slowly, and while it computed, the target slipped away. The men at Fort Sill asked a question that changed everything. What if the calculating weren't done at the guns? What if you created one place, one center, where the data from the observer flows in, where men sit who do nothing but calculate, and from which ready-made commands are handed out to all the guns at once? They called it the Fire Direction Center. The idea had specific authors. In the early 30s, the head of gunnery instruction at the Fort Sill Artillery School was a major by the name of Brewer. He and his instructors did something that seems dull, but in fact overturned everything. They abandoned the old way of aiming gun by describing the terrain. Hit that grove over there. Instead, they introduced the firing chart, a map on which both the positions of their own batteries, fixed to the ground by precise geodetic survey, and reference points in enemy territory were plotted in advance. Now a gun knew its exact place on the map to within a meter. All the observer had to do was point out where the target was, and the mathematics turned 2 points on the chart into angles and charges. This sounds like accounting. It was accounting. But it was precisely this accounting, this dreary work with a map, a ruler, and tables, that became the weapon the Germans failed to see. Because where the German crew ran its calculations anew for each target, the American center pulled the answer out almost ready-made, from an already plotted chart. Remember this chain of 3 links because the whole answer is in it. The observer up front is the eyes. He only looks and reports. He doesn't calculate and doesn't talk to the guns directly at all. The Fire Direction Center is the brain. It takes the observer's report, calculates, and hands out the commands. The guns are the fist. They only execute. 3 links: eyes, brain, fist. And they're linked so that between I see the target and shells in the air, not tens of minutes pass, but minutes. This is what they built at Fort Sill while Europe rolled toward war. Not a new gun, not a new shell. A new way to join the gun, the shell, and the eye into a single organism. And now, the most important thing. The thing the German did not understand in principle. Because this center, this brain, could do what the German system fundamentally could not. It could control not one battery. It could control a dozen guns at once, and if needed, it linked up with neighboring centers. And then a single target was struck not by 6 guns, but by all the artillery of a division, or of 2 divisions, on one report from one observer. The German observer, on seeing a target, could call down the fire of his battery. The American observer, on seeing the same target, could call down the fire of 100 barrels. The difference isn't that the American guns were better. The German guns were often better. The difference is that behind the American gun stood a brain connecting it to 100 others, and behind the German gun, only itself. But a brain must have eyes. And the eyes must see fast and speak fast. And for that, what was needed wasn't mathematics. What was needed was a thing the size of a backpack. Part 3. The Voice on the Infantryman's Back. Remember one thought. It's the heart of this whole video. A brain in the rear is useless if the eye can't call out to it instantly. And here is the second half of the answer, the half the German didn't see at all, because it can't be seen. Radio. While German artillery remained chained to the wire, the Americans gave their observers a radio. And not one bulky station per headquarters, but radios that reached all the way down, to the company, to the platoon. This is the key thing. Think it through. For the Americans, the spotter able to call down fire wasn't somewhere far off in headquarters. He was down below, with the infantry on the front line, together with the men who saw the enemy first. Sometimes it was a specially trained artillery officer attached to the infantry. Sometimes it was the infantry platoon commander himself, trained to call for fire. And on his back, or on his radio man's, was a voice. A radio reaching several kilometers through the din, through the interference clear. And sometimes the eye was not on the ground, but in the sky. Over the front line, unhurried, in circles, at a height of a few hundred meters, floated a small, fragile little plane. A light civilian aircraft converted into a spotter. No weapons, no armor, just a pilot, an observer with binoculars and a radio. German soldiers feared this quiet little plane more than the bombers, and learned not to move while it hung overhead. Because the moment a vehicle or a gun gave itself away, fire arrived within minutes. One captured German described it in a way that became famous. When that plane circles over us, everything freezes. We move only our eyes. Think about it. An unarmed plywood aircraft paralyzed entire units without firing a single shot, because it wasn't a plane, it was an eye connected directly to 100 barrels. Now assemble the whole chain in full, and you'll understand what happened at that forest edge. The German fired one burst from a machine gun. Somewhere ahead in the line of prone American infantry lay a man with a radio. He caught the flash. He caught the direction and the rough distance. Off a map the American surveyors had gridded out for him in advance, before the battle. He raised the radio and spoke a few words, not help, not a long conversation. A short, standard, memorized call for fire format. Who's speaking, what the target is, where it is. Those words didn't go to the guns. They went to the brain, the fire direction center. Men were already sitting there, calculating, and they already had the mathematics prepared for this stretch of terrain, because the Americans registered and computed key points in advance, crossroads, road bends, likely positions. The observer didn't have to wait for a calculation from scratch. The brain pulled out an almost ready-made answer, as if from a filing cabinet, and handed it to every gun within range at once. And here add the final touch, the one that made it utterly incomprehensible to the German. The guns didn't begin ranging. A salvo, see where it lands, correct. Another salvo, no. The brain could give the order so that each battery, standing at a different distance from the target, fired at its own second, and all the shells arrived simultaneously. The Americans called it time on target. The center gave the countdown. Each battery calculated its own flight time. The one farther away fired a little earlier, the one closer a little later. And 100 shells, fired from guns scattered kilometers apart, fell on a single point in the same second, with no warning, with no ranging shot to give the German a chance to realize he'd been found and run. The first thing the German heard was the last thing many of them ever heard. Do you understand now what happened? The German was expecting the old war. He fired and began to pull back, because by the old rules, minutes, even tens of minutes, were supposed to pass between his shot and the reply, while the enemy figured it out, while he relayed it, while the guns ranged in. Those minutes were always enough for him to get away. On the Eastern Front, they were enough for 3 years, but here they weren't there. The eye saw, the voice reached the brain pulled out the ready answer. The fist struck all at once, and all of it, faster than the platoon could change position. The German lost, not because he was found by some clever device. He was found by an ordinary man with a radio, lying in the infantry line. He was killed not by a super-powerful gun. He was killed by the speed with which the eye, the brain, and the fist worked as one. But the Germans had radios too. The Germans had observers too. So, why didn't they do the same? The answer to that question explains why they lost not a battle, but something far greater. Part 4. Why the Germans didn't do the same. Now the honest question a sharp viewer has been holding in mind from the start. The Germans were no fools. They were superb artillerymen, with perhaps the finest artillery tradition in Europe. They had radios. They had observers. They understood what fire correction was. So why didn't they assemble the same nervous system? There are several reasons, and each speaks to something larger than guns. The first reason is where the brain stood. For the Germans, fire control lived mostly at the battery level. The observer called down the fire of his battery. His few guns, to gather the fire of many batteries onto one target, required coordination through headquarters, time orders, slow. For the Americans, the brain was built from the outset so that one report could raise many guns, not because the Americans were smarter, but because since the 30s, they had designed the system precisely for this, for massing fire from a single center. The second reason is communication. German artillery kept too much on the wire, on pre-marked positions, on an unhurried order. This worked in defense, in static warfare, but it lost in mobile war, where minutes decide everything. The Americans pushed the radio down to the platoon, and the eye gained an instant voice. The German eye too often stayed mute, tethered to a severed wire. The third reason is shells. It's not enough to have a system. The guns must have something to fire. And by 1944, German artillery was starving. By some estimates, German guns in Normandy could fire roughly 1/10 of what the guns opposite them fired. Even perfectly directed fire is meaningless if there are no shells. Now put it all together. A brain tied to the battery, not the division. An eye tied to the wire, not the radio. A fist with nothing to strike with. Each of these problems is solvable on its own. Together, they meant that German artillery, for all its skill, always looked up at the American from below. To let you feel what this turned into in battle, one example. August 1944, Normandy, the town of Mortain. The Germans throw several panzer divisions into a counterattack to split the American front. The attack goes in at night, in fog, deliberately, to hide from the aircraft and from the eyes. But on a height above the town, cut off and surrounded, sit several hundred American infantrymen, and with them, spotters with a radio. And while the German columns roll along the roads below, these men on the height direct fire onto them, not their own batteries, the fire of several artillery battalions at once. Day and night, for 6 days, cut off from their own. Without food, almost out of ammunition, they keep the radio alive and call down fire on every German column they see. The German counterattack chokes, not because the American infantry on the height was more numerous or braver, but because a handful of men with a radio on a hilltop could talk to 100 barrels. That is what a nervous system looks like in action, and here is the scale it was capable of. At Cherbourg and in the breakout at Saint-Lô, a single American corps concentrated 250 guns and rained tens of thousands of shells onto German defensive strongpoints, coordinated from one brain. On the reports of observers, German artillery could not answer in kind, not because it didn't want to, but because it had no single brain able to raise that many barrels on one word. And here is the central lesson of the whole story. The German was looking for the answer in the wrong place. He was a man who thought in things. The better gun, the better shell, the better crew, and when he was killed by fire arriving from nowhere in 3 minutes, he searched for the answer among things. What device do they have? What gun? Where is the observer hidden? It never occurred to him that the force defeating him was not a thing at all, that it was the connection between things, not the gun, not the radio, not the fire direction center on their own, but the way they were joined into a single organism, where the eye, the brain, and the fist worked as one body. The German could capture an American radio. He could study an American gun. He could interrogate a captured observer. And still he wouldn't see the essential thing, because the essential thing was not in the parts, but in the connections between them. And connections can't be touched with your hands. Part 5. The verdict. Let's bring it all together. The German army had magnificent artillery. That's not an exaggeration. The German guns were excellent. The German artillerymen were skilled. The German tradition was one of the best in the world. Gun for gun, crew for crew, the German was often stronger, and that strength lost, not to a more powerful gun, but to a faster connection. The German asked the question, how do I make the better gun and the better crew? The American asked the question, how do I connect the eye, the brain, and the fist so that seconds pass between I see and I strike? The first question produced superb guns. The second produced a nervous system, and the nervous system won. But the main thing isn't in that comparison. The main thing is this, and I want you to carry exactly this away from here. German artillery was a collection of superb parts. The best gun, a skilled observer, a trained crew. Each part is on its own, was good and often better than the American one. But American artillery was not a collection of parts. It was a system of connections. An ordinary gun, an ordinary observer, an ordinary radio, but joined in such a way that together they did what the German superb parts could not do individually. The German assembled the best parts. The American assembled the best connections between the parts. And when the collection of superb parts met the system of connections, the collection of parts lost. This is not a German flaw. It's the flaw of any army that measures strength by the quality of the individual thing rather than by the speed with which its things talk to one another. The German invested everything in the parts. The American invested everything in the connections, and the connection turned out to be deadlier than the part. The German platoon commander lying behind the hedge at that forest edge knew none of this. He knew only that he'd fired one shot, as he'd been taught, that he'd begun to withdraw, as he'd been taught, and that 3 minutes later the sky came down on him. He cursed a secret device that didn't exist. He suspected an invisible spotter, though the spotter was the most ordinary one, just with a radio and a brain in the rear behind him. He couldn't believe that what killed him was not a gun and not some clever apparatus, but speed. The speed with which someone else's eye called out to someone else's brain, and the brain raised someone else's fist. His whole life he'd prepared for a duel of gun against gun, and what came against him was a nervous system. And between these two things, between the duel and the nervous system, lies the whole difference between the one who lost the war and the one who won it. The German artillerymen were no fools. They were the best at what they did. And that is exactly why they lost. They were undone by the belief that it was enough to have the best parts. But the enemy didn't set out to assemble the best parts. The enemy joined ordinary parts into a single organism, and that organism turned out to be faster than anything the German could put against it. If this story gave you a new angle on an old war, leave a like. It helps the channel reach those who want to understand history seriously rather than retell legends. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, and remember this. In war, as in life, the winner isn't the one with the best parts, but the one whose parts talk to each other the fastest. The Germans assembled the best guns, the Americans assembled the connections between them, and when the best gun met the best connection at a forest edge in Normandy, the best gun fell silent 3 minutes later, under fire that came from nowhere.